And Christ says, Revelation chapter 2, that I will take Jezebel and I will throw her on a bed. Okay, so now some translations say hospital bed or sick bed. No, the word is bed, and she doesn't get sick, as in a hospital. Men come and have sex with her. Christ is thrown her on a bed. Men come and have sex with her. We're not told if they are raping her or if she's willing to have sex with them. But Christ says he's going to plague these men and he's going to kill her babies. Christ is going to kill her babies. This is Revelation chapter 2, verse 22.
I want people to let that sink in for a second.
It's a horrible scene. This is Christ. This is Christ. And so there, the Christians, the synagogue, the Jewish community is understood to be empowered by Satan. Okay, that's not very ecumenical.
Yeah. Bart D. Ehrman, thank you for joining me again. Does it sound weird when I put your middle initial addressing you?
No, it is my middle initial.
It just sounds funny because I write it that way, but it's like Bart D. Ehrman. So Jesus is coming back next Thursday or Friday. I can't remember which day it is, correct?
Well, you'll know when it happens.
You have an upcoming webinar. I hope everybody takes the time to go and sign up. It's not costly and it's going to be informative on a topic that's dear to my heart. One of the last standing places I was within Christianity was eschatology. And it was Jesus said some things, or at least the Gospels say that Jesus said some things. And the book of Revelation, which you recently published a book on. So can you tell us briefly about what this webinar is going to be about?
So the webinar is devoted to the issue of the rapture. The rapture is this idea that you find in fundamentalist and conservative evangelical circles that says that Jesus is coming back, probably soon, to take his followers out of the world. The followers of Jesus will be raptured. They'll be snatched up, which is what rapture means. They'll be snatched up and taken to heaven so that they don't have to experience the next 7 years. The next 7 years will be a period of tribulation on the earth, horrible suffering. The Antichrist will rise up. There'll be military issues, wars everywhere, natural catastrophes, until after 7 years, even God gets fed up and intervenes and destroys the whole lot of them who have not sided with him. But the followers of Jesus 7 years earlier have taken out, so they don't have to be here for it. My lecture is on the rapture and where this idea came from, because everybody simply assumes that it's in the Bible, probably comes from the book of Revelation, and in fact, it does not. It doesn't come from the book of Revelation, and in fact, it's never in the Bible. That seems counterintuitive to people because they've heard verses from the Bible that sure sound like the rapture to them. And I'll be trying to show why these verses, in fact, are not talking about what they say they're talking about. And it's actually not that hard to prove, but people don't see it, have never been told this before.
You have gone on record saying Jesus failed as an apocalyptic figure. Am I right?
No, I don't think I've said he's failed, but I have said he was wrong.
Okay, so
I don't like to think of Jesus as failure, but Jesus thought that the end was coming in his own generation. He like other apocalypticists, he thought the end was coming in his generation. And no, he was wrong about that. It did not happen then.
So if we take your particularly, it's not just yours, it's a scholarly assessment that Jesus expected the Son of Man, which was not him, to come soon, and the kingdom of God, which was going to be a real, physical, actual kingdom of God on earth, which seems to be depicted in some way. Revelation, this millenarian figure named John on the island of Patmos, seems to have also this idea that God's actual kingdom is going to come to earth. Whether we interpret it that way or through the lens that, well, the Jesus is the one who's going to come and he's the Son of Man, both of those failed. No matter what path you take, it fails, unless you're a Gnostic who imagines this in some esoteric spiritual way. But then again, nothing actually happened, right?
The book of Revelation does think it's going to happen soon, and that it did not happen. But there have been, for the course of most of Christian history, biblical scholars and theologians have insisted that Revelation was not predicting that. It's not that they were Gnostics. They weren't Gnostics. But going back to St. Augustine in the 5th century, St. Augustine argued that when the book of Revelation describes the future millennium on earth, where there'd be 1,000-year reign of Christ here on earth, that he was actually talking about what was going to happen when the church took over the Roman world, that the church would reign on earth, and Christ would rule through the church. And during the millennium, in the book of Revelation, Satan is bound and is unable to harm anybody. And according to Augustine, Satan cannot hurt anybody in the church because they have the power of God behind them. And so Satan is bound for anyone who believes. And so the interpretation of Revelation that lasted century after century after century until relatively modern times was not that it's predicting the future. John himself thought he was predicting the future, but not in the way fundamentalists think. But he did think this was going to happen soon, and so he did fail at that. He was wrong about that too. But it's not that Christians have always thought that. Christians typically have thought that it's happening now. The millennium is now.
There's so much thought on this, and of course, I'm sure you're going to cover a lot of this in the webinar. I recently interviewed Robert J. Miles and James Crossley on the book Jesus, A Life in Class Conflict. And we were talking about Revelation in passing and this millenarian idea. I'm throwing out a few names. You know all of these people. Dr. John Dominic Crossan, his approach. And ultimately, what we walked away, and I'd love to get your thoughts on the book of Revelation being written by this guy named John, who is a millenarian. He thinks that it's going to happen soon. Apocalyptic wise, that God's going to come, bring revenge and judgment. But they think that there's some of that. There's still this like continuity to Jesus as a figure in a similar vein. I know that John's writing this later at the end of the 1st century, but that in that same vein, there's some connection. Do you think that while there's big differences, do you think there's some connection? Because you've mentioned in the past that Jesus's teachings were more love the poor and help the poor and stuff. And I know John's not mentioning that. I think he might be traumatized by what happened in 70. But do you think that behind the message of Jesus, it's like, well, God's going to come and make the least the first, or the last first, and the ones on the bottom on top, which means he is still going to destroy and kick the butt of those who are rich, who are, being the way they are toward his people. So there's still a butt kicking coming. It's just not as bloody and wrathful as we see in Revelation.
Well, no, that's been my argument about Jesus for as long as I've been a scholar, is that contrary to John Dominic Crossan, who does not think that is what Jesus was all about, I think Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. He thought that the end of the world was coming soon, that God was soon to intervene. He was going to destroy everything and everybody opposed to him, and bring in a kingdom where those who lived righteously would be rewarded. And so the issue for me with the book of Revelation is not whether it has an apocalyptic view. I mean, obviously, a book called The Apocalypse is going to have an apocalyptic view, and in the apocalyptic Jesus had an apocalyptic view. So they have apocalyptic views, but the way they work out their apocalyptic views are radically different from each other. In Jesus' apocalyptic view, for one thing, when God destroys his enemies, he's not going to torture them. He destroys them. In the book of Revelation, God destroys people after torturing them. And so that's, I don't think Jesus thought that at all. There's nowhere in the Gospels. There's nowhere. Jesus talks about the destruction that's coming, it's an annihilation. And John, in the book of Revelation, makes clear that it's not an annihilation. At one point, one of the catastrophes that hits the earth is that these locusts come out of a pit that spread all over the earth, and they have the power to inflict pain. They sting everybody except for the followers of Jesus. They sting everybody, and these people are in excruciating pain for 5 months and are not allowed to die. And so there's nothing they can do about it. And that's one of the punishments that God sends, that Christ sends in the book of Revelation. And, that is just not Jesus of the Gospels. Jesus of the Gospels he's not into the torture and into the prolonged agony. And so there's that difference. And the other difference is that the book of Revelation maintains that there's only a tiny slice of people that are going to survive this coming onslaught. It's not even all Christians. There are a lot of Christians who are going to be wiped out with everyone else and thrown into alive. They'll be thrown alive into a lake of burning sulfur. That's how they're going to be destroyed. But including a lot of Christians. And it depends precisely that you believe precisely the right things about Jesus, and you do precisely the right things about Jesus, which are the things that John himself believes and does. You do those things, you'll survive. Otherwise, it's off to the lake of fire. And that's not at all what Jesus taught. Jesus taught that, in fact, what matters before God is that you help those who are in need. Those who are poor, those who are hungry, those who are homeless. You take care of them, and God will welcome you into his kingdom. You don't, then you're going to be fried.
It's almost like John is obsessed with the idea of just separating yourself from Rome, really, in the participation in Rome. That is the achievement of not getting destroyed. He's so obsessed and angry, and this is me reading into it, but I imagine PTSD or some hatred toward what they did to the Jews in 70. And Elaine Pagels wrote about this in her book on Revelation, kind of wanted to get your comments on where, here's Rome, a male in this figurine. There's some gender studies that can be done on this, where there's a rape act on each nation with a blade to the throat of the woman, which represented the Jews. And so here's this man saying, God, how long? No, you're going to come in and I know what's going to happen. So the message isn't so much of like a conflict of treating poor people or people who are hungry or things like that. It's more like segregate or separate yourself from what Rome is doing, and that Rome is the bad guy in the whole picture. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I agree. I agree that Rome is the problem for the book of Revelation. I think it's quite clear. One of the things I do in my book on Armageddon is try to show how we know that, because for anybody who knows what to look for, historical scholars, this is just commonplace. When he talks about the beast from the sea that is referred to by many people call him the Antichrist. The term Antichrist does not appear in the book of Revelation, but this is the figure they call the Antichrist figure. It's quite clear this is the Roman emperor, and the enemy is the city of Rome. The whore of Babylon in chapter 17, the whore of Babylon is Rome, and that can be demonstrated from the text itself. 666 is a reference to the Roman Emperor Nero. This can be shown from the text itself. And so I do all that in my book. The one thing I disagree with is that I don't think that I don't know that this author was Jewish. I don't know that he was Jewish, and I don't know that the destruction of the temple per se that is caused him a lot of anxiety. He clearly thinks Rome is the problem, but it's not the Roman treatment of Jews that's the problem. It's Roman treatment of Christians, whether they're Jewish or not. And so that's in this book. It presupposes that the vast majority of the followers of Jesus are non-Jewish, and so I don't know whether he was Jewish or not, frankly. But definitely Rome is the enemy.
Now, what do we do with Paul, right? We talk about Paul. In some ways, you see it contradict Jesus, of course, in his letters versus what we find in the Gospels. But Paul's view of what is the parousia, you also find this language in Revelation of this kind of parousia, the coming of the Lord. And it seems like this author is aware of the Sibylline oracles. At least I've seen Nero Redivivus play its role in some of the Sibylline oracles as we see it in Revelation. So I'm kind of wondering, what does Paul contradict this guy, John? I mean, Elaine Pagels, I think, tried to make a point that she even thought maybe there's a jab at Paul in like the second angel to the church, where there's this idea of like meat sacrificed to idols. And Anyway, like, I don't know where you fall on some of these details, but what are your thoughts about John and Paul? Do they contradict in their views of the end?
They're broadly very similar, that there's Jesus is coming back to destroy his enemies and will bring in a kingdom. So they're broadly similar in many ways. I disagree with Elaine on this point. I don't think that Paul is the target of the book of Revelation. I think there's very slim evidence for that. The one point where they do overlap, they overlap in a number of points, but the one point has to do with food offered to idols, whether it's appropriate to eat it or not. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 and 10, and he thinks basically, you should not eat the meat. He talks about the pluses and minuses basically and says, yeah, but in the end, don't do it. John has a very decided view that anyone who is a follower of Jesus who eats meat that has been previously offered to an idol has committed a sin that will be punished horribly. God will destroy this person. His most vivid image of this is in his discussion. It's not of a Paul figure. It's a woman. It's a woman prophetess in the city of Thyatira. So it's a woman, and she's active in a particular church that Paul's never been associated with, Thyatira. And John calls her Jezebel. Jezebel is the name of a wicked queen who really was bad news for Israel in the Old Testament. And this woman is bad news for the Christians, according to John, because she thinks it's okay, John says, to eat the meat, as did some people in Corinth when Paul was writing them. It's okay to eat the meat. And the background of this, if you don't mind, I'll take a second on this because it's a really important passage.
I love it.
The background of this is that in the ancient world, you didn't have butchers who were just kind of setting up shop. Most people didn't eat meat a lot because it was expensive. But if you did eat meat, usually, almost always, it was meat that had been sacrificed in the temple. You've got a family party, or you got a block party, or something, got a neighbor party, you got a city party, and you go to the temple and you're going to have some meat, and you sacrifice the animal to one of the gods. And the meat, then the priests slaughter the animal and they butcher it and they skin it and they burn the skin and the bones and the fat to the gods or to the god. And then the meat gets, taken for the people to eat, and whatever is left over, the priests sell. And so if you're going to eat meat in the ancient world, you're buying temple meat. And so Christians wondered, is that okay? Because it's been offered to a god. And some are saying, we get more of this in Corinth, but in 1 Corinthians, but some are saying, well, yeah, it's okay to eat. Look, these gods don't exist. You're not really sacrificing to a god. If there's no God there, you can't eat meat offered to a god if there's no God. And so it's okay. They're just they're mistaken about this. And other people saying, no. This is participating in pagan worship. You can't do it. And Paul weighs in and says, yeah, okay, don't do it. But John weighs in and says, oh my God, if you do this. So Jezebel is saying it's okay to do. We don't know what she was saying. To put a good read on it, she might be saying, look, your neighbors invite you over for a meal and they're not Christian. You're Christian. Go to the meal, eat their meal. They serve you meat, eat the meat. It'll give you a chance to talk to them about Jesus. You can spread the word. Maybe they'll get more interested. You can invite them to the church. And, she may be saying something like that. But John thinks that she's the spawn of Satan for allowing people to eat meat offered to idols. And he said, this is in one of the letters that Christ dictates to John that he sends to this church in Thyatira, where Christ says that this Jezebel has urged people to worship idols and to commit fornication in Jewish thinking and then Christian thinking after it. Idolatry was always connected with sexual sins for some reason. So he says that Jezebel is doing this, and Christ says, in Revelation chapter 2, that I will take Jezebel and I will throw her on a bed. Okay, so now some translations say hospital bed or sick bed. No, the word is bed, and she doesn't get sick as in a hospital. Men come and have sex with her. Christ has thrown her on a bed. Men come and have sex with her. We're not told if they are raping her or if she's willing to have sex with them, but Christ says he's going to plague these men and he's going to kill her babies. Christ, is going to kill her babies. This is Revelation chapter 2, verse 22. So the outcome is very similar to Paul's, don't eat the meat, but the view of it is really quite drastically different.
I want people to let that sink in for a second.
It's a horrible scene. This is Christ. This is Christ. And so this is part of my view in my book on Armageddon is that the view of Revelation, the understanding of Jesus in Revelation is not the understanding of Jesus in the Gospels. And I don't think the view of this author, John of Patmos, I don't think his understanding of Christ is Jesus' own understanding of himself or of his gospel.
And there's a mention of Satan's throne too. I don't know if you've done any background knowledge on that. What the heck is that about?
In one of these letters that Christ dictates through John to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, he speaks of a church where that are being opposed by the synagogue, which is the throne of Satan, and so there, the Christians, the synagogue, the Jewish community, is understood to be empowered by Satan. Okay, that's not very ecumenical.
Yeah. This fits why you were saying maybe we don't even know what this author, like where, if they're Jewish or not, and it might fit within the trope of what we see happening later at the end of the 1st century, start of the 2nd, with this anti-Jewish or anti-Judaism, I'll say, rhetoric.
People use crazy arguments to argue this guy's a Jew, and he may be a Jew. John was a Jewish name, but he's living at the end in the 90s. You know, Peter wasn't a Christian name until Peter came along, and then till Jesus renamed Peter, then people started calling their kids Peter. So I don't know if this is a Christian who's named this person, their child, John, after one of the famous Johns, or whether, I don't know. He's not called John the son of Zebedee. But people use crazy arguments to say, well, he's got to be Jewish. You know, he quotes the Old Testament a lot. You know, he refers to the Old Testament. So he's got to be Jewish, right? Who else would know the Old Testament? And you think, what are you talking about? I mean, have you read anything? These scholars say this. I mean, First Clement was written just about the same time. First Clement is written by a Gentile, and the whole thing is about the Old Testament. The idea that only Jews knew the Old Testament, I mean, Christians, people who became Christians, who converted, or people who grew up in Christian families by the end of the 1st century, of course they knew the Old Testament. They quote it. And so when Paul writes 1 Corinthians, he's writing to people that he says were pagans. And he has the most complicated interpretations of the Old Testament, and he expects his readers to know what he's talking about. So it's a silly argument to say that if he quotes the Old Testament, he's got to be Jewish.
Wow. I have one more question for you, Dr. Ehrman, and that is all the research you've done over the decades, your scholarship. Would you say learning the historical, cultural significance to the context of the material we're reading, the book of Revelation, Paul's letters, the Gospels, whatever it may be, do you think that knowing that historical context played some role in you not believing it literally is true anymore? I mean, another way of phrasing it is, do you think finding out who, what, when, where, how, and why played a role in your deconversion?
From Christianity?
Yes, sir.
No, I don't. I have a lot of Christian friends, scholar friends, who would agree with everything I've said today, who are still Christians. I met up with one of my best friends last night, who's a Presbyterian minister, who agrees with everything I would have said just now. And so this kind of information will almost certainly, if you really look into it and buy into it, it will almost certainly lead you away from being a fundamentalist. It will be, and you're going to have trouble staying in the evangelical camp, even as a liberal, although you could do. But there are plenty of Christian scholars who are experts on Revelation. I mean, I think, famous scholars that if you know anything about the book of Revelation and you know who's written about it, say in the last 20 years, New Testament scholars, most of them are Christian, almost all of them. I can't think of anybody who's not a Christian, actually. So this is not what leads you away from faith. This leads you to an informed faith. So people who are Christian can still be Christian. Being Christian does not mean you believe in the Bible. Right. Being Christian means that you have this idea that there is a divine being in the world, and that Christ in some way manifests this divine being, so you can understand God better or relate to God better. There are lots of different kinds of Christian. I left Christianity because I thought that I could no longer accept the idea of a powerful and loving God in charge of this world, given all of the horrible, horrible suffering in it. And I just got to a point, I didn't believe that there's a God who's active in any way at all in this world. So that's why I left Christianity. It had nothing to do with knowing that there was no rapture in the New Testament, or that the 666 is Nero, or that the enemy of Revelation is Rome. It's got nothing to do with any of that. That led me away from being a fundamentalist and moved me away from being an evangelical to being a liberal Christian. But liberal Christian scholars agree with most of this.
So in that question, sorry, I'm keeping you just a tad bit longer here, is that you're hitting something important to me, is like, as a liberal Christian, that meant you probably still accepted that Jesus rose for some reason. I know John Dominic Crossan doesn't. He thinks it's more of an allegory or something. But like, as you deconverted, did your perception of the resurrection also change? Because now you're like, okay, God, how could he allow all this evil, this suffering, this wicked stuff that we see around us, like children and cancer and you name it. Oh, the list can go on. After you came to that conclusion, did you then reevaluate the resurrection, or were you already, as a liberal Christian, because I know you had a slow transition there, start going, well, maybe this didn't literally happen, but I still believe in the faith? I mean, when did you change your view on the resurrection?
I changed it before I left Christianity. I believed that the resurrection spoke a very powerful message about how death is not the end of the story. And that it's the same, in some ways, it's the same message of Revelation. I think Revelation is a really, it's a problematic book. I mean, there's a lot of evil that happens in Revelation that claims God is doing it, and I don't believe that. But the basic idea that at the end, good will triumph, and that God, however you define God will win. That basic idea I held on to as a liberal Christian, but I didn't think that the resurrection literally physically happened. I thought it was a metaphor for the fact that good will triumph and that death is not the end of the story. When I stopped being a Christian for these other reasons, because of the issue of theodicy, about trying to explain the problem of suffering, when I left Christianity for that reason, then there is no longer even an issue. I mean, God can't raise Jesus from the dead if there's no God. And so that one's easy. But as a Christian still, and again, I know a lot of Christian people, scholars, who don't believe in a literal physical resurrection of Jesus. They don't think that happened. They don't believe in a virgin birth. They don't, that isn't what they think Christianity is all about. Many people say, well, you can't be a Christian if you don't believe in the Bible. Well, I deal with that in my book in a footnote, actually. I actually am dealing, sorry, now I'm taking your time, but people tend to think that the book of Revelation, that everybody seems to think that it's predicting our future. Fundamentalists think it's predicting it correctly, and they know when it's going to happen, or it's going to happen soon. But even the person on the street, the woman on the street, you ask her what Revelation's about, she says, well, it's predicting our future. Even though she's like, she's Jewish or something. I don't know. She's not, it's like everybody thinks about the book of Revelation. It's predicting our future. And that view is modern. That view, the reason everybody has that view is because fundamentalists won on that point. Fundamentalists convinced everyone that Revelation is talking about our future, even though that was not the view of the church for, 1800 years. And so, but fundamentalists have now convinced everybody that that's what it's about. They're wrong about that. But the other thing they've convinced people about is they've convinced everybody that if you don't believe in the Bible, you can't be a Christian. That is just stupid. I mean, it's not even like bad theology. It's just stupid. I mean, how can you possibly say that you have to believe in the Bible to be a Christian? What about the people who were Christian before there was a Bible? You don't have our New Testament formulated, kind of finalized until what, the 4th, 5th century? And so like everybody before that wasn't a Christian because they didn't believe in the Bible. And where does Jesus go around saying that, if you want eternal life, believe in the Bible? You don't find that anywhere in the Bible. And look at the Nicene Creed, the creed that formed the basis of Christian faith for centuries and centuries. We believe in God Almighty, God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. And, it goes on and gives the things you have to believe to be a faithful Christian. It doesn't mention the Bible. And so why do you think believing the Bible is it? Because the fundamentalists told you that. The fundamentalist said, if you don't believe in the Bible, you can't be a Christian. And everybody said, oh, really? Oh, God, I guess I'm not a Christian then because I believe in evolution. But liberal Christians, like smart theologians, are saying, what are you talking about? Believing the Bible is not what Christianity is. Christianity is about believing in Jesus. It's in some way. It's not about believing the Bible. And so, anyway, especially here in the South, people just say, well, you can't be a Christian if you don't believe in the Bible. So, where are you getting this from? Anyway, sorry, that was my little soapbox.
I loved it. That was such a good soapbox. Bart, me and you, we know that there's a rapture happening sometime soon. So we want people to make sure they sign up for this lecture, because if they don't go, what will happen to them is going to be
they'll be left behind.
Yeah. And you know what happens to people who get left behind?
Ooh, it's bad. Whew. Very bad. Very, very bad. So you don't want to be left behind.
You really don't, Bart. I'm excited about this lecture. I always enjoy learning from you. All of your courses, of course, they can go to your website and check them out. This one is going to be amazing. It's going to be live. We can go check it out. Thank you for giving us your time today and teaching us a little bit about Revelation. We got a real deep sneak peek. Get the book, sign up for the course. Any final words from you?
No, but except also go to my blog, the Bart Ehrman blog. I talk about this stuff all the time, 5 times a week, every blog post going back 10 years, and I raise money doing it for charity. So why not?
Thank you, Bart.